EuroMemo conference is our annual workshop for not only discussing the current state of affairs with respect to the ongoing European issues, but also for preparing the substantive work of the Euro Memorandum Group, and particularly also in preparing the drafting of our annual publication, which is the Euro Memorandum. And that is the reason why it is both, if you want, an academic conference, but also a workshop that allows us to develop our points of view, to develop our analysis. So we are very grateful for any contribution that we receive in that working process, because it aids us and it helps us in preparing our annual publication. Following up on the theme of last year's conference on the need for a Green New Deal for Europe, this year's conference will particularly address the need for a profound socio-ecological transformation of Europe as perhaps the last chance for a progressive form of European integration. And we do that in response, if you want, to the twin crises of both climate change, the climate crisis, and also the COVID-19 pandemic. And given the COVID pandemic, the focus will particularly be on discussing policy proposals of how we can establish a truly transformative agenda that both deepens global cooperation on vital issues of humanity, like climate change or public health crisis and many other issues, while at the same time also reinforcing local sustainable development in Europe, as the European economies and societies have been hard hit by the impact of the pandemic in the European Union. All our plenaries of this year are dedicated to discussing issues related to this task. As is already the tradition for many years, today's opening plenary will start with an overview on the political and economic state of the Union. And given the impact of the COVID crisis, we'll also have a third keynote on the impact of the COVID crisis from a feminist perspective. Before we invite our keynote speakers to start their presentations, let me also give you a few explanations on the technical aspect of today's discussion, as we've already experienced some problems. During the three presentations to follow now, you will have the opportunity as participants to ask any questions to each speaker via the chat function. In the chat function, you can write down any questions that you have, and we will then collect the questions, also me together with my co-host Jonas Nitschke, and each speaker will have the chance to address the questions, the respective questions, after the three keynote speeches. So once the speakers have then responded to the questions from the chat, depending on the time available, we will then have, in the final part of today's opening plenary session, 1 or 2 rounds of comments also from the audience, where you can raise your virtual hand and indicate that you would like to take the floor and make a comment or ask any other question to the three speakers. Okay, so hopefully everything is now set and we are ready to start. We have now 3 presentations. We start with the political state of the Union presentation. This year's presentation will be given to us by Claude Serfati, who will present his analysis of the political state of the Union. Claude is an associate researcher at the Institut de Recherche Économique et Sociale, and also a senior lecturer at the Université Versailles Saint-Quentin en Yvelines. Claude is an economist working on industry and innovation policies, the political economy of militarization, and also on, for example, financial globalization. He's also active on the advisory board of Attaque France, and is also a peace activist, if I'm correctly informed. So we'll start with Claude. Claude, thank you very much for agreeing to present your views on the political situation in the European Union. You'll have 20 minutes for your presentation, if I may ask you to stay within that time frame. If you have a PowerPoint presentation, you can just share the screen so that everybody can see the PowerPoint presentation that you would like to present to us. Okay. Yes, we see your presentation now. Perfect. So Claude, floor is yours. You have to turn on the audio, the microphone. So, can you turn on the microphone now?
Okay.
Yes, I hear you. Perfect.
Okay. So thank you very much to the organizer. So I would begin with a short. Oh, I have time to be active. Ah, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You have to move the slides.
I would like to begin with a basic and background hypothesis. So in my view, the pandemics was not a thunderbolt in a calm sky, but it exacerbated trends already at work for years. It's what I call the 28 moment. I mean, a combination of seismic change in the economic and geopolitical landscape. And in that way, since the financial crisis, we had a world-scale economic competition stiffened, and probably, of course, the post-COVID crisis will exacerbate it. And this competition includes between the US and the EU, which began not only before COVID, but also before Trump policy with the failure of the so-called transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Then we have an increased geopolitical rivalry, which was aggravated by the disastrous effect of the 23 Iraq war, and then in Africa by the 2011 French-led initiative of war in Libya. This opened a space for the rise of China as a geo-economic power, assertiveness of Russia, and ambition of regional power in Middle East. And finally, the COVID crisis did not create social upheavals, which began in Tunisia in 2011 and are still in progress throughout the world, Sudan, Lebanon. Probably the post-COVID crisis will stimulate further social unrest throughout the world. So I think that to be brief on that there is a very little currency to claim, as the mainstream does, that the outbreak of the coronavirus is a textbook example of an exogenous shock. No, it's not an exogenous shock, and I am not a student of long-term macroeconomic growth, but we can turn to very, very good literature by Francisco Lusa on Kalecki and Mendel. So the 28 moment and the crisis of the virus crisis set in a new historical setting, which in my view shortens at the world level, shortens the distance between economic competition, I mentioned before, and geopolitical rivalry. And again, there is little doubt that the crisis, the current crisis, will shorten further this distance between economics and geopolitical. And of course, it is a challenge for the EU as such. I do not think of member states only, but the EU as such. So very briefly, because I guess that my colleague will expand on that in their presentation, I will just mention that the management of the pandemics by the EU revealed the flow of the EU institution. My nation first think of the two engines, so-called engines of EU, France, and Germany, which very early banned exports of personal protective equipment. Then we've seen a déjà vu situation with the threats of economic and social implosion closing the ranks among member states with the decision taken by the Commission, by the European Central Bank, and finally by the European Council through the new recovery facility. I jumped very quickly on that because my colleague probably will address that. But the pandemic crisis also reveals a situation of déjà vu as far as the crisis will accelerate austerity and anti-democratic policy at the EU level. One, the new recovery package will not address structural imbalances within the EU. Two, according to an expert at the pro-European think tank Bruegel, Davos, the final version adopted mitigates the favoring of lower income countries in the Commission proposal and benefits larger countries. And three, the recovery package was based on a fragile compromise between member states, the detailed mechanism, the so-called Brussels art of the fudge. Four, the crisis saw the strengthening of the member states and marginalization of the EU Parliament during the process. And five, EU and member state policy can be summarized as follows, as said by two experts from the European Investment Bank: COVID-19 and the EU labor market, corporate health matter. I mean, only corporate matters. So I would like now to address the more geopolitical situation created by what I call the 28th Amendment, which accelerate, in my view, EU militarization. It is a stated objective by the Commission LMM, by the head of the EU Commission, that the geopolitical commission that I have in mind, and it is that Europe urgently needs, and the similar declaration was made by Joseph Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. It's not only a stated objective, it's already a reality. We have in the EU powerful military member states with a rich, I could say, colonial record, and this record is still alive. In 2019, the EU spent 356 billion euro, that is 8.8% more than in at the beginning of the decade. We have 5 EU member states arms world exporters. And just to finish on that, we have a proposal by the Commission, maybe cut down, but we have a proposal by the Commission to spend 13 billion for the European Defence Fund to be created during the next budget union. And finally, we have to think of militarization of the EU, long supported by internal force. I mean, not only the external environment will accelerate, is accelerating the EU militarization, but we have within the EU strong internal forces. I think one of some member states, in particular France. I think 2 of industry, electronic, aeronautic, and defense industry, of course. And finally, I think of the Commission eager to support an agenda, a defense agenda, to gain momentum in a field which, from which it was ruled out by the treaty, the Roma Treaty. So what are the consequences of the 28 moment and of the militarization of the world, I would propose two theoretical, so to speak. I develop at length from a theoretical point of view these two proposals. One, the configuration of the world space, I prefer to speak of world space rather than globalization, is at any moment shaped by the combined and complex combination, of course, of the dynamics of capital accumulation and the international system of states. And two, the international positioning of any country in the world is based on a mix of its economic competitiveness and its political military power. I have not time to develop how this framework is different from the so-called soft and hard power developed in the mainstream literature. Of course, the combination, the mix of economic competitiveness and political military power differs between countries, suffice to compare how France and Germany within Europe, and they are comparable, of course, are so much different in the management of the mixed I just mentioned before, economy and military. So what about the EU as such, not the member states, but the EU as such? I would argue, again, I have no time to develop from a theoretical perspective this point, I would argue that there is no point to expect the creation of a single European defense, like the single currency, because of the strong differences in their place, I think of defense and money, in socio-economic relation. I know that in the mainstream, and not only the mainstream, unfortunately, defense and money are called public good, but I think it is very, very irrelevant to really analyze the complex relation between defense on the one hand, money on the other, and the social relation, the socio-economic relation constituted in capitalism. So I think that we cannot think, or for some hope, of a single European defense with further integration and more integration with 5 steps proposed by Bella Bellassa, for instance, in the economic field. The fact that member states and defense occupies a very specific place in national, domestic, socio-economic relation means that there is serious divergences among member states on what would be a European defense, a European army, European sovereignty, strategic autonomy, etc., etc. So the fact that there is no point to expect the achievement of a single European defense does not mean that there is no militarization. I would dare to say that instead, the hybrid configuration of EU, which is a reflect of its historical development, facilitate to some extent. I mean, the hybrid configuration of the EU facilitates and enlarge the militarization of the EU. You can have a common, the so-called common EU defense and security policy under the umbrella of common EU defense and security policy, a la carte defense policy which does not slow down militarization, but to some extent enlarge the scope of initiative. Let me just mention, for instance, that at one end of the spectrum, you could have France carrying out military operation on its own in Africa, and you could have at the other end of the spectrum the united front. We can speak of a united front of member states against migrants. They were they agreed, all member states agreed for the next union budget to considerably increase the EU funds allocated to security, that is repressive measure. They agreed to triple the Frontex and other border budget between 2021 and 2027, and to create a standing corps of around 10,000 border guards to protect against the new enemies from within. I mean, I think of the migrants and maybe more, or more than the migrants. So, in my view, I'm not sure, and I hope to be clear. The fact that there will not be a single defense in Europe does not mean that there is no militarization, and to some extent, the opposite, the other way around function. I mean the diversity of member states as far as their relation between economy and military are concerned facilitates the large spectrum of militarization of the EU. And under which umbrella the common defense and security policy in Europe is functioning, it is under what Robert Cooper, the advisor, the diplomatic advisor to Tony Blair, who moved as a top advisor to Javier Solana, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy in Europe, called a liberal imperialism. He explains that the world and Europe was a new liberal imperialism, and on which kind of policy is based this kind of liberal or humanitarian imperialism, if you want. It is based on what a high military called before the European Parliament in 2019, the triangular relationship between terrorism, immigration, and instability. Note the looseness of the world and the so-called concept of instability, which allow, of course, a large room of maneuver for security and military measures. But I would also mention that it's not only a military before the European Parliament. More and more you can read in the official literature by the Commission or the European Council that terrorism are associated with migration, or only separated by a comma. With this so much loose political agenda, I mean a security agenda, you have a confusion between enemies from abroad and enemies from within, and you can see that during the COVID crisis, of course, in most European countries, specific lower end of the society was targeted by a repressive measure. So it's not the case only in France, but as far as I know, in many countries in Europe, you have a very, very uneven socially and politically uneven treatment of the crisis in European countries. So the confusion between enemies from abroad and enemy from within will probably, unfortunately, increase in next years. You have a confusion between economic and military threats. It's what I mentioned when I spoke of the shortening of the distance between economic competition and geomilitary rivalry. You can see everywhere in the world that any dramatic economic competition becomes immediately a geopolitical stake, immediately a military threat. You have a confusion and then in the interaction between the so-called public agents in charge of defending the order against external or internal measures with private agents, the privatization of military and police. All of them, I mean, all the umbrella of the security melting with defense agenda, in my view, is opening in the context of what I defined as the 28 moment, a larger range of opportunities for further militarization of the EU. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Claude, for this presentation, which was raising a couple of issues that obviously are of high importance given the current international framework. And we will certainly also have a chance to discuss the international, the role of geopolitical rivalries and what that means for the European Union foreign and security policy in the other plenaries, particularly in the plenary on 22nd of September. Well, obviously the COVID crisis has changed also economic policy making in the European Union, and so I'm very happy and very pleased that we have now a second speaker with us, Euclid Tsakalotos, who by his very nature of having been Minister of Finance of Greece from 2015 to 2019 has been very actively involved in economic policy making at the European Union level. So Euclid has also worked as an academic. He's a university professor at the University of Athens. And as far as I'm informed, he's now a member of the Greek Parliament. So I'm very happy that we have Euclid with us, who will start with giving his views and his analysis of economic policies in the European Union over the last 12 months, roughly speaking, and also give us his views of what alternative policies in the current conjuncture would be necessary before we then move on to our third speaker, which will be Maria Clara Messini. But before that, I'd like to give Euclid the floor and also ask you kindly to stick to the 20-minute time frame.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Werner. Thank you very much to the EuroMemo group, not just for organizing this conference under difficult circumstances, but all the work that's been done over the last years. It's been very important in the battle of ideas to have a group of economists who get together, discuss and sign things. So the title of our session is Deep Crisis, Lack of Solidarity and the Threat of Disintegration. And my basic point is yes to all three. We are in a deep crisis. We have got a severe lack of solidarity, and there is a serious threat of disintegration. It's not surprising, really, because if you think of the crisis as beginning in 2008 and 2009, I think most people would agree that the proximate causes, ultimate causes, leftist economists would disagree more, I think, but the proximate causes would be the great inequalities in the period of neoliberalism after the 1980s, the financial sector, which had a momentum and a logic of its own during the 2008-2009 crisis, and the macroeconomic imbalances, whether between the United States and China or between southern economies of Europe and the northern European economies. We have a historic defeat of neoliberalism in the 20 years up to 2009 in economic terms, more or less in any category, indice you would like to mention: growth, productivity, stagnant wages, and of course the great inequalities. And we have a situation where investment is very low, both public and private, as a percentage of GDP, as firms naturally, rather than spending and investing in new products, new markets, new technologies, prefer to make ample use of the available workforce at low wages, precarious employment, and so on. So it's not surprising that the crisis has continued after 2009, since none of the three issues, inequality, the state of the financial sector, or the macro imbalances, were addressed. In the period before 2009 and in the period after 2009, we followed the strategy that has been aptly named by Wolfgang Streeck, borrowing from the future. In the whole period of neoliberalism, including the 2009 crisis, including the response to the 2009 crisis, we have an increase in debt of nearly all kinds: private debt, corporate debt, financial debt. And of course, that creates a particular problem for the Eurozone. To put it in a very short way, a common currency is just incompatible in the long run with very large differentials in debt to GDP ratios, for very, very many reasons, not just that the monetary transmission mechanism collapses when you have this differential debt to GDP ratios between South and North, but also for very serious political reasons, because the call on solidarity as it's addressed. After the 2009 crisis, we had business as usual. We instead of looking for a new approach to address the crisis of 2009, we had a re-implementation of austerity. We had Wolfgang Schäuble telling us in nearly every Eurogroup that nothing was wrong with the economic and social policies of the past. What was wrong was implementation, implementation, implementation. That was his key phrase in the Eurogroup. Greece at that period, after the crisis of 2010, was a guinea pig. And as a guinea pig, it did its best, especially I think under the government of Syriza, to stay in the Euro, to fulfill its commitments of the Memorandum of Understanding, but also successfully show that national policies up to an extent can work. So we did improve the Gini coefficient, we did increase spending as a percentage of GDP in health and education, we did manage to have a policy that reduced child poverty, but of course all of you know that there are limits to what you can do at a national level, let alone at a national level within a memorandum of understanding, which was imposed on Greece, but was, of course, was a message to all other leftist and progressive forces, or that might have had the opening of appetites in Spain, in Portugal, and in Italy especially. So we had the reimposition of austerity, we had the ECB, the central banks, trying to fill in political failure through quantitative easing, a strategy that has continued after the COVID crisis. I was in the Eurogroup meetings for 4 years, and Draghi kept saying, apart from the fact that he had helped by his statement of whatever it takes in the summer of 2012 with a program, that monetary policy cannot address the problems of European integration and the threat of disintegration. You politicians have sort it out, and Lagarde has continued the same policy, saying that monetary policy cannot help, and she has supported Eurobonds, as has the EuroMemo group for many years. It's a bit tragic that leftist economists have to say good words for central bankers. You wouldn't have thought that wouldn't have been your priors before 2009, but I think it says less about central bankers than what the state of politicians in Europe as elsewhere. So with all that drive up to this crisis of the COVID, we now have a greater recognition of the climate crisis and how you respond to that, and we also have the COVID crisis itself. The initial response was a lack of solidarity, especially if you're Italian. I think you will have felt that very, very strongly, but also in other countries as well. We had the response first from Lagarde in the same way as we had it with Draghi, when we had the politicians dragging their feet until we got to this recovery fund, which I'm sure will be part of the discussions of the whole conference, its nature, how much it does create some kind of break with previous practices, in fact, on the grounds of borrowing at a European level, with, on the other side, issues to do, whether it's a one-off, as the Frugal Four have been arguing, issues to do whether it can be stopped, the money, because the government doesn't pursue the reforms that the Commission and other member states would like to see. There are huge areas to be discussed, but I think it is an opportunity to discuss the details of how that money is going to be spent, and to the extent to which it can address the huge problem of the Eurozone, which is, and Claude did touch on this, that we expect divergence, not convergence of the European economies, and that is just not compatible with a single currency. There will be another issue to do with the recovery fund and all the national responses to do, which will be an increase in the debt to GDP ratios. This is going to happen throughout Southern Europe, but also Northern Europe, as well as the factor of differential increases and whether that is sustainable. And the question will be what the question always is in these situations: who will pay? What? Not only the good news that we have a suspension of the tight fiscal rules in the Eurozone, in the Growth and Stability Pact, and how long that will last. But when we get out of the crisis, what will be the debate on how quickly those rules are reimposed, if they're reimposed at all? And if they're not reimposed, what is the view of our view of fiscal sustainability and debt sustainability? And how can we get out of this crisis of borrowing from the future? Because the borrowing of the future, it doesn't matter if you're a centrist, a leftist, or a rightist, cannot go on forever. So one of the issues that should be discussed, in my view, in the European framework and in our conference is how do you get back from, how do you address this issue? Not only where the money from the recovery fund should be spent, but how you get a different kind of development policy together with fiscal sustainability and debt sustainability. Because if we do not address that issue, be very sure that our opponents will do. And it will be the usual story that the only way to address debt sustainability and fiscal sustainability is to have a reimposition of austerity. If not that, what must be a major question. I think overall that having discussed, having followed previous conferences and previous memoranda, I think at the core of our approach should be addressing inequalities. Because I think that the inequality issue is key to nearly everything we want to discuss. It's key for a new macroeconomic and development model. We will not have a new bout of development unless we imagine very authoritarian solutions, I'll get to that in a moment, without addressing stagnant wages and addressing inequality. We will not get investment in the kind of green development we want and in other areas with stagnant wages. Therefore, inequality is important for addressing inequalities at the core of addressing a new economic model. It's at the core of dealing with COVID, because I'm sure Maria will say something about this, that the COVID has had a very differential effect on social groups, men, women, rich, poor, and therefore the response needs to address those inequalities. I'm convinced that inequalities are at the core of addressing the climate change. I just cannot imagine a sustainable response to the climate change unless we deal with inequalities. It just won't happen. It's not only a matter of a fair transition in particular areas that are lignite or coal heavy. It's much broader issue about who has access to energy and so on. And finally, dealing with inequalities is central to dealing with the crisis in politics, the crisis of political representation, which started in 2008, and we see social democratic parties that once used to get 40% now getting 5 or 8%, because exactly after the convergence of centre-left and centre-right politics, you did not address those issues. You did not address not only the increase in inequalities, you did not address access to wages, access to the welfare state. You did not address the stagnant wages, the middle class families that had the prospect of their children being worse off than they were. So if you do not deal with inequalities, you will not deal with the crisis of politics. And that seems to me a key issue. So I want to end this bird's eye view with a few constructive comments, which I've just started on. And I see the crisis that we're now one as a triple crisis. It's a crisis of the economy, and society, it's a health crisis, and it's a climate crisis. Now, there's good news and bad news in this. The good news is that in all major capitalist crises of the 20th century, especially the 1930s and 1970s, is that we did not have a reversal to the status quo. There was no turning back. The world after the 1930s crisis, with the war in between, of course, was completely different in the 50s and 60s from the 20s. And the world in the 80s, after the crisis of the 70s, was very different from the crisis, the period of the social democratic consensus with increasing wages, full employment, and so on. Yet again, I believe that there'll be no turning back. So that is the good news, that it could be an opportunity for progressive politics that knows where it wants to go. The bad news, of course, is that it could go in a direction which is far worse than the neoliberalism of the 80s and the 90s. And that's why I gave quite a bit of emphasis to the crisis of political representation and the rise of populism. Not to attack populist politicians, which I don't mind doing, attacking Orban or Salvini, but for the much more serious business of understanding the social causes, the social roots that lead to people to vote for Trump, Johnson, Orban, and other populist politicians. So that is the battle, what is at stake. That we could have a new hybrid neoliberal authoritarian system coming out of this crisis. And Claude's issue about defense and defense spending and militarization, how we deal with borders, is part of that danger. I see it. It's not the only part, but it's an important part of where Europe is going. And he made mentions of Frontex and so on, which are particularly worrying for us. So to avoid that, I think we need to win the battle of ideas. I grew up in Britain in the 1970s. And before that is the election of Thatcher in 1981. And I won't forget the experience, because you could actually see the neoliberals winning the battle of ideas. And they didn't just win it in economic arguments through the economists, but also in culture and in many aspects of life. The battle of ideas were being won by neoliberals after the exhaustion of social democracy at the end of the... So I'm very aware that the EuroMemo group and the Euro Memorandum have a very critical role to play in this battle of ideas. I'm enough of a Marxist and a leftist to know that life doesn't progress just on ideas, but I really think it's very important not to belittle how important that battle of ideas. And we have the objective conditions for that. because the whole issue of the COVID and the economic crisis has made people think again about what are the important things in life. What are our relationship with nature? What are the relationships between ourselves? It's brought to the fore that many of the things that economists who are more socially aware, economists and sociologists who care about participation, who care about ecology have been saying for a long time, feminists, economists who hate Homo economicus and understand that people grow up in relationships with families and parents and so on. All that critique, which is common to most of us here speaking and I imagine listening, those things have come to the fore in a much greater part of the society, because people now are beginning to understand not just what our relationships with each other is, but what is it that we eat? How is it produced? How we eat? Is it? So this is the issue of whether COVID is also an exogenous factor or not an exogenous factor. What are the food chains? How do we address food chains and COVID? So I think that is very, very important. So what I would say, if I had been asked before, what would be a conference title maybe for the future, are what are the links between the health crisis, the economic and social crisis, and the climate? Because I think there are links both in the analysis, how these three crises have come together, but also in response. I've given my answer how I see you should respond through the issue of inequalities. That it doesn't mean that capitalist crisis is due because of inequalities, but inequalities are there, and addressing the inequalities in a time of crisis gives you a link to discuss many issues and the links between them. We don't, of course, need just the battle of ideas. I see it very difficult. I see it almost impossible to conceive a change that doesn't go to the authoritarian right and populism, but goes to the direction that most of the people of this conference would like, without a rebirth of social movements, and therefore feeding social movements and discussing with them the issues at stake, whether it's climate, whether it's health issues, whatever it is. And finally, of course, what our conference is mainly about a political economic program for addressing the Eurozone. I think, and this is my last comment, the program is very, very important, because Europe is actually facing an existential crisis. There's so much the ECB can do. There's so much that politicians of the center right can do. But in the end, the common currency is not compatible with differential debt, with differential growth, with differential social and economic standards, with differential levels of inequalities. And if those are not addressed, the existential threat will become an actual eventuality. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope I've kept the 20 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Euclid, for also a very disciplined presentation, keeping with the time frame. And also thank you for your suggestions for the work of the conference and the discussions that we will have over the next 3 weeks, which will certainly discuss the details of the economic policy measures, the recovery measures, etc., that the European policymakers have now started. It will certainly also focus on issues of inequalities and how the triple crises that you have mentioned will relate to each other, and what we can learn from the relations between these crises in terms of proposing alternative policies. Well, when we talk about the current conjuncture and the state of affairs that we are currently in and that we are facing, and the problems that emanate from the current situation, obviously the corona pandemic plays a central role. This is one of the reasons why we also decided to have a third presentation that particularly deals with the impacts and the challenges that come out of the COVID crisis. And we've asked Maria Karamesidi, who's a member of our steering committee, and also has a large track record both as an academic researcher and professor, but also as a former president of the National Employment Agency of Greece, in dealing with policy issues related to labor and employment, social policy issues, issues of the welfare state, and also feminist policies and politics. So I'm very happy that we have Maria with us, and I give the floor now to Maria to give her presentation on the impacts of COVID from a feminist perspective. Maria, you need to share the screen also.
Yes, I need to share the screen. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I will start with saying that Euclid made a very good bridge to what I'm going to say about the economic and social consequences of the COVID crisis from a feminist perspective, which is putting the agenda of gender inequalities in the discussion and debate of what Europe we need and what progressives should do in order to put forward their own agenda for the changes that the EU should have in the next years. I will start by saying that the ongoing COVID crisis is very different in nature from others, and that policy responses have also differed from the 2008 financial crisis at both the national and the EU level. I won't expand on that because it is very well known that there is a health crisis that has ignited an economic crisis through the deliberate shutdown of the economy and the confinement of the population. I will go on saying that all crises have gendered socioeconomic impacts, and the COVID crisis is no exception. And why is that? Because this crisis result from, and different gendered socioeconomic impacts result from differences in women and men's position in the employment and social protection system and the division of unpaid domestic work and care. This is one thing. The burden, the actual burden of the crisis falls on men and women, not only because of their positions and pre-crisis positions and roles, but also and importantly on the nature of the particular crisis and its course, and on how policies introduced to address the crisis mitigate or exacerbate its gendered socioeconomic effects. So there is a combination of factors that shape outcomes from a gender perspective. COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted, not just interrupted, the normal functioning of our economies and societies, and disruption carries the risks of reversal in social progress, but also provides opportunities for progressive change. And this is also the case for gender equality that feminist economy seeks to promote. I will deal in this presentation with the gendered effects of COVID crisis and the medium-term risks and opportunities for gender equality, and also on, I will deal with what is and why we need a feminist agenda for the socioeconomic and the socio-ecological transformation of Europe. I will start from the first consequence of the shutdown and confinement. This is the big rise in unpaid care work, mainly falling on women, and this for a list of reasons: school and nursery closure, facilities for elderly and disabled suspended, childcare by relatives and privately paid carers and domestic workers stopped being available, and the limited hospitalization of non-COVID patients obliged to remain at home. The second gender socioeconomic consequence is the work-life balance problems for women still working outside home or working remotely from home. A third consequence is the rise in gender-based domestic violence everywhere, because the confinement increased the vulnerability of women to violence by abusive partners, family members, or carers. And the fourth consequence is that female workers were more exposed than their male counterparts to COVID and to work intensity and long hours, since the women constituted the majority of those working in frontline essential services: healthcare, personal care, food and drug supply, cleaning, etc. All these services require physical presence and social contacts. Now I turn to a very important gendered consequence, which is the job loss and unemployment. These are the labor market effects who have a gender dimension. Unlike previous crises, in which the male-dominated construction and industrial sectors were the first to be hit, the pandemic has caused a lot of damage on female-dominated sectors, which are wholesale retail trade, accommodation and food services, personal services, and services to household. We would also expect women to have a higher rate of job loss, a higher than male rate of job loss, because they are overrepresented in non-standard forms of employment that makes them more vulnerable to job loss. By looking at the data, this is not confirmed. I mean, the job losses were not higher for women than for men, at least for the first quarter of 2020. And I explain with this graph. During the first quarter of 2020, we had a slightly higher fall in male than female employment in the EU, and much higher fall in male than female employment in the euro area. As regards unemployment, where we have data for all months until July, we can see that we had the same rise in unemployment rates for men and women in the EU on average. This brings us to the conclusion that for the time being, women and men were almost equally hit, and this makes a difference with the previous crisis of 2008, when men, which were much more hit in the first round of the crisis than women. So there is an equalization because this COVID crisis has had a great impact on private services. Let us now turn to the policy responses in the labor market. We can make an assessment of what has happened with the job and income protection schemes that were largely used in all EU countries. We had job retention, short-time working, and temporary unemployment schemes that were put in place everywhere, as I said before. It was not the case in the 2008 crisis. And another novelty is that they covered all sectors, not only manufacturing, but also in services. And at the same time, the great innovation is that there has been a widespread development of income protection schemes for the self-employed. From all these schemes, there have been exclusions. Domestic workers, seasonal workers, part-time workers, or mini-jobbers were not protected in many countries. And women are overrepresented among these groups, and informal workers that are excluded from social protections by default. So there has been an unequal protection of men and women during the COVID crisis because of the position of the women's position among the domination of unprotected groups. Now, relative to the medium-term risks for gender equality in the labor market, we estimate that there will be a lack of adequate hiring opportunities for women in countries with great dependence from tourism and hospitality and rise in female unemployment. We also expect an acceleration of automation in personal and consumer services, both female-dominated sectors. And also we expect a normalization of teleworking, not as a right of the employee, but as an imposed choice by the employer. This is a risk. And knowing that women are teleworking more than men, this is a particular risk for women if there is no regulation of teleworking guaranteeing the rights of workers. Now I turn to the second part of my presentation, and I will deal with what has the pandemic revealed from a feminist perspective. The first thing is the centrality of caregiving for social reproduction and the immense value of care work for the society, either professional or unpaid, which is mainly provided by women. Second, the scope and continuum of caregiving, including healthcare, social and personal care, and education of all those in need of assistance and in a state of dependency, not only children, the frail, elderly, and the disabled, but also the victims of violence, the homeless, the drug addicts, the refugees, etc. The third thing that the pandemic has revealed is the importance of the welfare state and public provision of care for ensuring public health and the right of citizens to be cared, as well as women's engagement in paid work, their economic independence and gender equality. Fourth, the pandemic has revealed the need for a more equal sharing of care and domestic work between men and women, and to combat gender-based domestic violence. And sixth, the need for the EU to build a more universal social protection floor, less dependent upon past employment records or employment status. This is a selection of things. It's not an exhaustive list, but it is a selection of the most important things from a feminist perspective. And now, what is a feminist agenda for the socio-ecological transformation of Europe? The feminist agenda is about creating a care economy. This was a proposal made by feminist economists, this proposal was elaborated during the 2008 financial crisis as part of a progressive agenda for a sustainable recovery. But this agenda was finally adopted many years after, but just before the pandemic, by the European Women's Lobby. This proposal, this agenda, calls for a paradigmatic shift towards a care-based economy through large public investment in social infrastructure and job creation in health and care sectors, the re-evaluation and wage rises in care occupations, the decent work and wages and combating in declared domestic work, and the recognition and equal sharing of unpaid work between women and men. At the macroeconomic level, this feminist agenda of creating a care economy makes a critique of GDP as a measure of economic success and calls for a sustainable development model in which economic development does not deplete natural resources and social care. And all these feminist economists calling for a care economy have also demonstrate a fierce opposition to austerity policies. I will deal quickly on the reasons why we need a care economy. First, to promote equality while tackling the crisis of care. It's the first and most important reason, the crisis of care. And what do we mean by crisis of care? We mean that societies in the economically advanced world are becoming less and less able and willing to provide caring labor, which is an indispensable component of well-being. And it's an indispensable component of well-being recognized by the pandemic crisis, which has added a new argument in favor of this feminist plan, the need to prepare for future health crises. The development of a care economy is crucial if we need to prepare for these health crises, which are linked to the ecological crisis and the climate change. Now, the Next Generation EU funding and the revised EU budget represent an opportunity for advancing the feminist agenda. And I come to my concluding remarks about the opportunity that crisis of capitalism give to social movements in order to pronounce new social claims which fit with the flaws of the prevailing model of capitalism. In the 2008 global financial crisis, there have been many calls against global financial markets and tax havens, the financialization of the economies and neoliberal capitalism, economic inequalities and austerity. The COVID-19 crisis became a wake-up call for a paradigmatic shift towards a sustainable and just Europe, focusing on health, care, and the environment. There is a wide public demand for a more caring Europe nowadays, which is expressed by many civil society organizations, and which is conducive to push forward the feminist economic project in the EU. Already the European Parliament requires the application of gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting to the new multi-annual financial framework and the Next Generation EU regulations. Progressive forces should build upon this wide public demand and acceptance by the majority of the European Parliament of the need to push forward the gender proposals for combating gender inequalities in order to join forces and integrate the care deal in the agenda of socio-ecological transformation of Europe. We should not miss the opportunity.
Maria, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, which was very compact and I think very topical in terms of raising issues that have become very pressing during the corona pandemic, in particular with respect to the gender impact of the crisis and also the calls for integrating the care economy into any proposals for socio-ecological transformation in Europe. Here in Austria, it was quite interesting because there were a large coverage of female workers, particularly say in the health sector and also in the retail sector, where many people, including policymakers, politicians said, now we see what are really the necessary jobs for our society in terms of caring for the basic needs of the population. But so far, at least, apart from a couple of symbolic acts and symbols of gratitude, nothing has happened. So I think this is something that needs to be integrated into any progressive policy agenda on the issue of how to promote a more equal gender division of labor and integrate that into our proposals for our next Euro memorandum. So thank you very much to all three speakers for their interesting and comprehensive overviews on how they see the recent changes in the European Union, both on a political level, also on a geopolitical level, economic level, and also in terms of the impacts of the corona pandemic. We now have still some 40, perhaps to 45 minutes to go. So I'd like to suggest that we first collect the questions that were asked via the chat function and also via the questions and answer function of our program. Each of the speakers has the opportunity to react to these questions. And then after we have commented on the questions and given the requested answers, we will then move into a public discussion where individual participants can raise their virtual hands, and I will and we as hosts will enable the speaking function, and these colleagues then have the chance to give a comment or ask a question. We will see how many people we can take in one round, and then we'll see also whether we'll have a chance for a second round. But let's now start perhaps with the questions that were written down in the chat function, and I would like to give the floor to Jonas, who will refer to each individual question, and then also give the floor to each of the respective keynote speakers to respond. So we start with the chat function. There has been a question to Claude Serfati from Wlodek Cimarski from Poland, that refers to the issue between a potential conflict between the European Union and Russia, particularly with respect to the Baltic Republic. So I suppose, Claude, you are aware of the concerns in Eastern Europe with respect to the presumably expansionist agenda of Russia. So how would you assess the situation in that respect?
Yes, I would say that I am not an expert at all on Eastern for the poverty of my answer. I would just give some flavor of what I feel. There is no doubt that in the mix of economic competitiveness and political military power, Russia ranks high, very high in the use of political military power. And it's a good illustration of my analytical framework. You could compare Germany and Russia, for instance. France more closer to the US as far as economy and geopolitical issues are interacting. So, of course, I suspect, I'm sure that the Eastern population is afraid of the Russian ambitions. I am not sure that these ambitions are to be carried out practically. I mean, I'm not expert, I said, on the relation in Eastern Europe, but I am sure that Putin, I am not in the head of Putin, of course, would begin again what he did in Ukraine. I mean, not only history does not repeat forcibly, but also Putin has to take into account a kind of other configuration in Europe. I mean that the fact that Germany raises, the German government raises its voice in threatening, including to stop the Nord Stream gas. I do not think it will do, but the simple fact that he mentions that is also a kind of awareness by the German government that now, as her former Ministry of Defense von der Leyen said, we have to play the card of geopolitics. So I think that the balance of power are not exactly the same between Europe and Russia as they were during the Ukraine invasion, so to speak. And two, I am not sure that Europe has the military weight to resist to Russia ambition. I mean, of course, France has a nuclear deterrence. Britain, even out of Europe, could close the ranks with Europe on that issue, but it's not only a military issue. It's the second point of my answer. I think that before thinking of the military capability of Europe to resist, we have to think of political relation between in the world in general and between Europe and Russia. So I hope that my analysis will not be crumbled by future events, but I would say that for the moment, I do not think that Russia is prepared to invade Russia, to invade Belarus. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for this response to that particular question. Jeremy Lehman, our member of the steering committee and friend from the UK, raised the issue of the debt, the public debt that has been, or that is currently and in the near future accumulated as a consequence of the crisis. And Euclid, since you addressed the issue of debt sustainability, I think it would be interesting to hear your views on Jeremy's suggestion that perhaps given the very low interest rate levels that we experience currently in the European Union, the short-term rise in public debt, particularly in the case of bonds with very long-term maturities, will be rather low. So also given perhaps the ongoing debate in left political circles about modern monetary theory and the whole issue of whether we should be concerned about public debt, given the low levels of interest rates, is something that you would like to respond to. You have to turn on the mic.
Okay, sorry about that. So I had that question, and looking at both the chat and the question and answers, there was a question about low interest rates and avoiding austerity. There was the question from Jeremy, and there was a question about whether inequalities means we should reconsider property rights. And I'd like to address all three questions as a package.
Perfect.
Very shortly, not just because I've been a politician since 2012, I was an academic for the previous 20 years of that, but even when I was economist, I tend to look at these things in political economy. Nothing that we've discussed today, also from Claude and Maria, is going to happen without a radical transformation of power in favor of working people, excluded people, and those middle class people that have been excluded. So whatever we say, the answer is going to be not only in economic terms. The economic terms will give us some feeling of what's going on, how much debt we can have, but how we address the issue is going to be in terms of political economy. So I accept that low interest rates makes us more comfortable with debt than with high interest rates. I'm in favor of I was in favor of the Spanish proposal that the recovery fund should be addressed with a perpetual bond. Jeremy speaks of a war bond. I think it was Jeremy who said about the war bond. I'm in favor of all those things, and I think it's a good start. But in the end, the analysis, the response will be, has the left got, on the one hand, a new productive model of how the economy is going to work, and secondly, is that compatible with a macroeconomic strategy? So we can extend to the future, we can borrow from the future, but we can do that up to some point. At some point, we also will have to address the issue of fiscal and debt sustainability. And that brings the question, which is always the political question. The political scientists tell us that the political question is always who can do what to whom when. And that raises the issue of the tax system and the wealth taxes and carbon taxes, all the agenda the progressive economists have been discussing, and Thomas Piketty and a large number of other people. We have to address that issue. There are solutions for the short term and the medium term in war bonds, perpetuals, and so on, but we cannot forever, I judge, not only because interest rates will at some point rise. If they don't, we have serious problems with what that means for long-term growth. But essentially, at some point, we have to address those issues. And that needs some serious thinking about redistribution. And that is also my answer to the question about do inequalities mean we have to look at property rights? I think the answer is yes, but we have to be politically clever in the way we do that. That's why I raised the issue of Thomas Piketty and wealth taxes. I think we can do it through the tax system, but we can do it by changing also the model. That's why I'm so interested in most of the things that Maria has to say when she discusses the care economy, what that would mean. That also is an issue of transforming not only power relationship, but what people value. What Maria said about the care economy is very important to me, because it's more important that she's saying it now than it was said in 10 years ago, because now people are understanding in the COVID crisis why are more open. Their ears are more open to the kind of things Maria is saying now than they would have been 5 years ago, because I think people are beginning to revalue what is important in life. Is it to have a proper care economy that is well paid with it, or is it to have the G5 and then the G6 and the new iPhone and so on? I said it in a very populist term, but I think most people can understand. So whatever we discuss, and my final statement is that it has to be looked in terms of political economy. You have to have a view about the production sector, how you have different forms of production. It's not just about the care economy, but it's also about how the energy field is opened up and you have new producers, re-looking at cooperatives, re-looking at small-scale production, networking and all that, but looking at it in terms, not having any illusions that all these things need a radical transformation of power relationship, and that needs both ideas and social movements and programs. And Werner, I'm very sorry, I just wanted to say that I have to leave 7 o'clock sharp, 7 o'clock Greek time, presumably 6 o'clock your time, because I have a parliamentary debate that I have to go to. So I had
okay.
5 to 7. It's not rudeness that I don't want to follow the discussion. I'm sure Maria will inform me of the discussion, but I do have to leave at 7 sharp. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you, Euclid. There was also at least one question I see in the chat that particularly addressed Maria's presentation. Maria, have you seen the question posed to you by, I think it was Marika Frangakis?
Yes, it is Marika.
Yes.
She's asking if after the worst of the crisis is over, there will be turning back for women. I don't understand what you mean by the way Euclid said in relation to the overall socioeconomic paradigm, but I suppose that you mean that if there will be a widening of inequalities after, because of women having been, because of the crisis in a deteriorated position. This is what I understand from your question. I have to say that I don't believe that the women will turn back to a worse position than the one they had before the pandemic. And I don't think that the pandemic will necessarily widen inequalities, gender inequalities. We didn't have this experience during the 2008 crisis, and we didn't have this experience even in the EU countries that were worst hit by the crisis. I mean, the Southern European countries and the PIGS, all countries that had been imposed the austerity programs, where employment had collapsed for men and women. During the crisis, women had increased their participation in the labor market everywhere, even though they had been unable, most of them, to find jobs, but they had remained in the labor market. And after the crisis was over, they continued to join the paid labor. I mean, they continued to have access to employment. So I don't think that women are going to turn back. I think that this crisis is a crisis where both genders will be in great stress. This is different from the previous crisis because many job protection schemes are being put in place. I think that and this has shown up in the figures of unemployment. Unemployment has climbed just by 0.7 percentage points from December to July, which is not very much if we consider what happened in the previous financial crisis. And I think that the most negative consequences of the crisis are going to show up in the end of this year, the beginning of the next year, when all these job protection schemes are going to be removed, and then we will have the impact, and we see the impact of the deteriorating economic situation on unemployment. So I don't think that women are necessarily will necessarily be exposed to more job loss or unemployment than men. This is my estimation. And anyway, we are not going to leave the labor market. They have never done. There has been a quiet revolution since the beginning of the 20th century. There is not going to be a backlash, and we are not expecting that.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I think that was quite. Your understanding of the question was quite correct. I think Marika made clarified in a second chat input that she meant it that there will be no turning back for women. So I think your interpretation of the question was a module of our program, which referred to the issue of the increasing desire of people, particularly in the UK, for the local, and whether that means that if you want solidarity at a European level will be potentially weakened as a consequence also of the Corona crisis, and what does that mean for if you want a progressive form of European integration, also given that also the geopolitical situation and the regional disparities between European member states arguably also weaken solidarity for the European project or for other European citizens. So perhaps this is something that could be addressed by Claude, given that you spoke about the dimension of geopolitical rivalry, geopolitical imbalances, and also Maria, perhaps you could step in and give us your view on what does the desire for the local mean in terms of constructing also supranational and international solidarity. Have you seen the question? It's in the question and answer function, not in the chat.
Yeah, okay. What is is it the last one?
The last one, question. In the UK, a 2018 published report on civil society, etc., etc.
I can read it. I can't read it.
You can't read it?
No. In the chat?
Not in the chat. No, in the question and answer, Q&A.
Oh, sorry.
Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Local and other tension feeds into economic and
Ooh.
I think it's quite a hard question, obviously. I mean, I would agree that in a way, obviously during times of crisis, local communities and the desire for local solidarity is certainly strong, and also local communities to some extent at least, are solidarious, so as express solidarity to each other. But I would not be sure whether that automatically means that European solidarity is weakened by that. I think the crisis of European solidarity, or the challenge to European solidarity, is what we've seen in terms of the political discussion about the impact of the COVID crisis across different European countries, and the way European policymakers have addressed this issue. So the discussion between, say, the Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Conte, and the German public or the French public has shown that there is obviously a lack of solidarity, and that this lack of solidarity has indeed left a very large negative imprint on the feelings and on the views of, say, Italian citizens vis-a-vis the European project. So on that dimension, I think there has been an impact. But perhaps you might have a different view on that, Claude and Maria.
Yes, no, I have a different view, but I know that there has been, at least for years now, the willingness from population to raise a bottom-up movement. I do not think from the altermondialist movement in the early 20th century, but more recently, the feeling that Europe is very far from the reality. So I know that with an attack in France, but there is an attempt with other European alternative movement to build something like a network of rank and file, so to speak, initiative. I do not know exactly until where this attempt succeeded to do, but I know that we need, I think we need this kind of initiative starting from the bottom in Europe. One of the challenges which was raised during the Greek crisis was that at the top level of the left political organization, or even extreme left sometimes organization, there was a real difficulty to build only discussion on the Greek crisis. I mean, in some spaces, it was a silence which prevailed, and we were not keen to discuss and to really address, which are very natural discussion, exit or not, which kind of solidarity and so on. So I think that what of the lesson of what happened in the early this early decade is to try to raise a bottom-up coordination at the European level. Probably it's difficult for lot of reasons, including cultural reasons, but I think that we cannot escape this kind of initiative. In France, we had the Gilets jaunes. It was a very bottom-up movement, but it remained domestically based, and the danger is that by staying on domestically, it turned right-wing. I mean, it considers that Europe is the enemy, and of course, it's not the language I am holding now.
Okay, thank you. Maria?
Yeah.
Would you like to join?
Yes, I would like. I'm not sure that I share this remark. It may be true for the UK, but my experience from Greece is that I cannot identify in the Greek society, the civil society desire for refocusing on the local. I mean, I have noticed exactly the opposite. And perhaps the pandemic has contributed to this as well. I mean, everybody has been trying, because of the confinement, to learn and to from the internet, from whatever source, to know what's happening abroad. And people have been following very closely all developments in all parts of Europe and in the world. I mean, I think that this pandemic has made us share this problem, the health problem, our vulnerability. Many people and thinkers speak about the shared vulnerability because of the pandemic, this sense that we have. And we have, I think that is something which becomes even more constant as the pandemic evolves. And if we will have its second wave, this sense, I think will grow even more. I think that perhaps this pandemic has made us refocus on the global and the European. And this is one of the great opportunities also. Because the health issue is a common issue, the care issue is a common issue. And I spoke about the care deficit, and the care deficit that is even more obvious than before because of the pandemic. We have realized not only the lack of public hospitals and intensive care units and things like that, we have all realized that we are part of the same world where privatization has taken place, where we share common problems. So I think that the pandemic has created a new interest among the public and the public, both citizens, and to understand what's happening everywhere, and realize that we share common problems. And this revival of the international, European, global, etc., is a very big opportunity to speak of Europe like as our common preoccupation. And I think that Greece is not the only country where this has taken place. I think that confinement has made us all more thirsty to understand what's happening around the world, and not only in our home, in our community, because we were not able to communicate. We were not able to find each other, to come together. I mean, it was also a way of a time of reflection and of getting to know more about what's happening in the world. So I think that it's a good moment for relaunching the debate on Europe.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it's quite good to hear a more optimistic note on the propensity of people also to share in the fate of other people in the European Union and beyond that. But I would like to...
Excuse me,
Yes?
I would like to add something. I don't know if this has happened in your countries as well, but the problem with telecommunications, because during the confinement, was terrible. Not only because people we are doing Skype to speak with their family members that were not in the same household, etc., but also because they were intensively reading news. I don't know if this has happened in your environment, in your country, etc., but this was something that had never been seen before.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I would like to at least give, within the remaining perhaps 10 to 15 minutes, give the participants the chance to also raise their voices and make comments. So if you raise your virtual hand, which is a feature that is offered by Zoom, I can see the raised, the flagged hands, and then I can give you access to the microphone, so I can open the microphone, and then you have a chance to speak. So I see one raised hand by Trevor Evans. Trevor, I unmute you now, and you should have a chance to speak to us. Trevor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Thank you.
Thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I wanted to take up one or two of the points that you said raised, but it appears, has he left already?
Yes, he unfortunately had to leave now, yes.
I thought he said, yeah, okay. One of the things that he started off with, which I think could be elaborated on, is the growth of excess capital in Europe. That since the euro crisis was partially overcome from about 2014, there has been a growth of profits, but investment in fixed capital has been quite low. And in the last couple of years, the modest expansion that began after the euro crisis has been falling. Investment has been falling in Germany for a couple of years, and France, which was beginning to pick up, also fell last year. So what we've seen is a weakening, and now with the massive amounts of money being put into the system, what we're seeing is this huge growth in financial investment and financial assets, boosted, of course, on the one hand by low interest rates, and on the other by these massive amounts of liquidity. One of the other things that I think within that's very important is the divergences in the euro area, which are not new, but which are getting worse. And that with the expansion since the end of the so-called euro area crisis, what we've seen is that there has been a growth, some growth in trade amongst the southern European countries and some growth amongst the northern European countries. But the growth between Northern Europe and Southern Europe has actually been declining. And perhaps most striking there is the case of Germany, where Germany has lost certain interest in the EU. It's been investing in the Eastern European countries, Czech Republic and so on, which have become part of its production networks. And it's had this huge investment in Asia, above all China. So German capital is not investing in Germany, but it is investing in the East, looking to China, looking to Asia, looking to Russia. And Claude, you mentioned the oil pipeline. It's very unlikely. I mean, Russia is really important for German capital. And although one or two politicians are beginning to call for the end of the pipeline deal, German capital is on television here, I'm in Berlin, every night saying about how important it is to keep these political disputes separate from investment decisions, so very clearly. And very lastly, it's clear that Merkel and Macron were worried about these tensions, particularly with the case of Italy, and they have responded. But fundamentally, I think there are these really big tensions. And if we look at what the EU has agreed this year, it's agreed to these quite big investment programs, 390 billion. But if you think about what the EuroMemo has been calling for, we have been calling for this for every year for 10 years, and crucially in the public sector, because the private sector, the private capitalist sector is not investing. And a European strategy that tries to motivate growth of private investment is very unlikely to bear much fruit. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Trevor. We have a second hand. So I invite Marcella Corsi also to speak. So we collect a couple of comments and then we go back to a final round to our keynote speakers. So next is Marcella. Marcella, can you hear us?
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Great. So first of all, I wanted to thank Maria for her excellent presentation of the feminist challenge related to the COVID-19 crisis, and stress once again what she has already said, the importance of care, the importance of the health crisis, and the need really to get prepared for this. Plus, I want, and of course, as I wrote also in the chat, this is something that we will discuss also in a panel in the afternoon on September 23rd. So, of course, I invite all of you, if you are interested, to come and join us for this discussion. But I wanted also to add something concerning Italy and the latest results that might be of some interest because in some cases are similar to the one presented by Maria, and in some other cases are a little bit different. First of all, about women employment, Maria has rightly stressed the difference between this crisis and the previous one, the 2008. So we are not actually facing a e-session, as it was called in the 2008, because of the loss of job on the male-dominated sectors, but vice versa, we are actually observing similar characteristics at European level for women and men employment losses. But it's not the case in Italy. So I wanted to stress that according to the latest employment data that has just been released by our National Statistical Office, actually there has been an increase in employment in the first quarter of 2020, and most of this employment was of women, which of course makes a big question mark on what type of employment has been created at that time. It might be, of course, employment created in the health sector because of the crisis, the health crisis that we have experienced. At the same time, it could be quite interesting to explore a little bit better what care means in our country. And this is especially the case for elderly care. The second aspect that I wanted to stress is that while on the one hand, the women are more and more involved also in the recovery because of employment trends that I just mentioned, at the same time, there is a total lack of services for women, as is well known, of course, because this is a standard feature for Italy, but even more now because of the difficulties for women to send children to school, because of the incredible turnovers that have been invented to send children to school, and so on. So in that sense, we will see quite a lot of new challenges in the near future, and I'm very happy to have this possibility to discuss with all of you about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella, for this comment, and also for extending an invitation to join your workshop, your parallel workshop on September 23rd. Okay, so as far as I can see, these have been the two participants that wanted to take the floor. There's, I think, no more. So let's go back to our two keynote speakers and wrap up today's session. When we speak about the upcoming challenges for also writing the Euro memorandum and also for obtaining from our discussion some key conclusions and proposals with respect to using them as an input for our work on the Euro memorandum, I'd like to ask both of you, Maria and Claude, what would be your top priority in terms of proposal that we should take from this debate today and use as an input for our work on this year's Euro memorandum. Who would like to start? Claude, would you like to start with your final comment?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the organization of the webinar. So I see at least 2 points relevant for the conclusion of the debate and the prospect of the next report. I think that we have to start from what Trevor Evans said about the the deepness of the crisis. I mean, the idea that we should propose a radical economic measures have to start from the fact that we are convinced and really convinced that the actual way is leading to the catastrophe. And I think that it's not a matter of analytical view I mentioned here. It's of course to make very concrete proposal. I mean, it's clear that the way Europe, capitalist Europe, is run now cannot resolve and cannot address the issue which were mentioned. I mean, economy, health, and environment. So I think that we should start from the awareness of the deepness of the triple crisis, so to speak, and radically challenge the way the European Union is managing this way. Of course, 750 billions are nothing, not only quantitatively, as Trevor said, but also qualitatively. I mean, what I mentioned in my first slide is that it's corporate first. And we should find an alternative slogan, so to speak, to what the top manager of the European Investment Bank said, but they said on behalf of all the European business and all the member state government, no, it's not corporate first, it's people first. So, but to put forward this kind of slogan, we have to think of the gravity of the crisis. And of course, just to defend my field, I think that a second point, or the report should take it into account, is that the shortening of the distance between economic competition and geopolitical rivalry raise a very huge challenge as far as peace issues are concerned. The issue has been raised by Dimitris. It has been raised also by Rhinus in his question. I have no time to respond, but I think it is right to raise the question of competition. And I think that it's a point which was already addressed in I think the 2016 Euro Memorandum report, the growing militarization of Europe. But now we have really to think and to discuss that it's not only a field which stands beside economy or beside European governance. Militarization is now, for reason I try to explain, militarization now is at the heart, so to speak, of EU governance. Of course, under very, very different way, not the aggressive way stand by Putin, or not in the aggressive way defended by Trump, even though Trump is not so much aggressive on military issues, except with China, of course, except with China. So the difficulty to address militarization in Europe comes from what I said. I mean, a very a la carte defense policy, but notwithstanding this fact, I think we have now to really address our military through, for instance, security, the very false and umbrella concept of security, I challenge for a long time, is now taking its grip in Europe, and under the umbrella of security, member states and the European Union are organizing what I call militarization. Militarization is not only invading a country, it's also the hunt to migrants and the repression in the lower ranks of the population. So they are the two topics we should address in the report,
Okay.
in my view.
Thank you very much, Claude. Final words to Maria.
My final word would be that in the EuroMemo we should stress the problem of inequalities and the need to introduce the inequality issue in the growth model and the socio-ecological transformation of Europe project. Gender inequalities are part of the global inequalities that we have been discussing, and it's a very important dimension of inequalities. The pandemic has renewed interest in the care deficit of our societies and has pinpointed the persisting gap in unpaid labor between men and women. Building a caring economy means that we take the challenge of putting forward a public investment, a great public investment program that upgrades not only the public health system, but also the care system, the social care system, and integrating the care deal next to the Green Deal is essential for having and building a sustainable development model and alternative model for Europe. These are my final words.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. I think this is something that we should indeed take with us from today's discussion, that the care economy should be more prominent in the work of the group, and that we should consider it also to include it in the Euro Memorandum. Okay, so thank you very much to all our keynote speakers, also to all our participants. I'm very happy that in the end we managed to have a very interesting and lively debate given our initial technical problems. Let me finalize today's plenary by turning your attention to the next plenary we have featured in our conference program, which will take place in 1 week, next Tuesday, 15th of September at 4 p.m. Central European Time. And we will have 3 distinguished speakers that will address the key challenges and proposals for socio-ecological transformation in the European Union in the twin crisis, or in the shadow of the twin crises of climate change and COVID-19. So we are looking forward to continuing our discussion next week by dealing with the specific elements of the socio-ecological transformation in the current conjuncture. So thank you very much once again. Have a very nice evening, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Okay,
Goodbye.
thank you to you, Werner, and the organizer, and the participants.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.